The estate sale was advertised in the local newspaper as "Everything Must Go, 3 days only." The old house on Maple Street had been sitting empty for 6 months after its owner died, with no living relatives to claim her possessions. I wasn't looking for anything specific when I walked up those creaky front steps that Saturday morning. Just browsing, really, the way you do on weekend mornings when you have nothing better planned and too much time to kill. The house was packed with people picking through decades of accumulated possessions. Furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, dishes with floral patterns that went out of style before I was born, clothes from every decade since the 1950s. All the things that make up a life being sold off piece by piece to strangers who would never know the stories behind them. I wandered through the rooms slowly, not really seeing anything that caught my interest. Most of it was too old-fashioned for my taste, too heavy and ornate for my small apartment downtown. The furniture was the kind of dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The decorations were all doilies and ceramic figurines that would look ridiculous in my modern space. I was starting to think I had wasted my morning when I walked into what must have been the old woman's study. The room was lined with empty bookshelves and filing cabinets that had already been picked clean. And there, hanging on the far wall like it was waiting specifically for me, was a painting that made me stop walking completely. It showed a skull with long flowing hair, painted in shades of green and gray that seemed to shift and change as I watched. The face was angular and sharp, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw that suggested both intelligence and determination. The eye sockets were deep and dark, like tunnels that went on forever into some place I couldn't imagine. The mouth was slightly open, showing perfect white teeth, arranged in what might have been a smile or might have been a grimace. Something about it made me freeze in place. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light fell across the painted bone, creating shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. Or maybe it was how the hair appeared to flow and shift, even though it was just oil on canvas. The skull looked almost alive, like it was thinking about something important, like it had secrets to share if you were brave enough to listen. I stood there for at least 15 minutes just staring at those empty eye sockets. Other people walked past the painting without giving it a second glance. One elderly woman actually shuddered when she saw it and hurried out of the room, muttering something about morbid nonsense. A young couple laughed at it and made jokes about Halloween decorations. But I couldn't look away. There was something familiar about the bone structure, something that reminded me of my own face in ways I couldn't begin to explain. The painting was larger than I had initially thought, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet, in a heavy wooden frame that looked handmade. The frame itself was beautiful, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to complement the dark subject matter. Someone had taken great care in presenting this image, treating it like something precious and important. A small price tag hung from the bottom corner of the frame. $800. That was significantly more than I had planned to spend on anything. But I found myself walking over to the checkout table anyway. My credit card was in my hand before I had consciously decided to buy the painting. Something deep in my chest was telling me this was important, that I was meant to own this particular piece of art. The elderly woman running the sale looked genuinely surprised when I pointed to the painting. "Are you sure about that one, dear?" she asked, glancing back at the skull with obvious distaste. "It's been hanging there all morning, and you're the first person to show any real interest. Most people seem to find it rather disturbing." I nodded and handed her my credit card. $800 would put a serious dent in my savings account, but the feeling in my chest was getting stronger. like I was making the most important purchase of my life, even though I couldn't understand why a painting of a skull would be important to anyone. The woman processed my payment slowly, shaking her head like she couldn't understand what I saw in such a dark and morbid image. The previous owner was quite fond of it, she mentioned as she handed me my receipt. It hung in her bedroom for over 30 years. She always said it helped her sleep better at night, though I could never understand how. Personally, I think it would give me nightmares. She laughed nervously and busied herself with other customers, clearly eager to move on from the subject. Getting the painting home proved more challenging than I had anticipated. The frame was much heavier than it looked, made of dense dark wood that felt solid and substantial in my hands. I had to make 2 trips to my car, first carrying the painting carefully, and then going back for the protective wrapping materials the sale organizers had provided. By the time I got everything loaded and secured, my arms were sore, and I was breathing hard from the effort. The drive home took nearly 30 minutes through Saturday afternoon traffic. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror to make sure the painting was secure in my back seat, wrapped in old blankets and wedged between boxes to prevent it from sliding around. Twice I had to brake suddenly when other drivers cut me off, and each time I felt a spike of genuine panic about damaging my expensive new purchase. It was already precious to me, even though I had owned it for less than an hour. My apartment was on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian house near the University District. The building had character but lacked modern conveniences like an elevator, which meant carrying the heavy painting up a narrow staircase with a sharp turn halfway up. I had to rest twice during the ascent, leaning the frame against the wall while I caught my breath and adjusted my grip. Once inside, I unwrapped the painting in my living room and got my first good look at it in different lighting. The afternoon sun streaming through my windows made the colors seem richer and more complex. The green tones in the skull's face appeared to shift between sage and olive depending on the angle of the light. The gray shadows seemed deeper and more mysterious. Those eye sockets continued to draw me in like they were hiding something important just beyond my ability to perceive it. I spent the next hour trying to decide where to hang it. The living room wall was too bright, making the painting look washed out and somehow less powerful. The hallway was too narrow, cramping the image and making it impossible to step back and appreciate it properly. The kitchen felt wrong, too cheerful and domestic for such a serious piece of art. Finally, I carried it into my bedroom and held it up against the wall directly across from the foot of my bed. That felt perfect, absolutely perfect. From my bed, I could look at the painting comfortably for hours if I wanted to. The skull seemed to approve of its new home, if such a thing was possible. Those empty sockets were positioned so they appeared to be looking directly at whoever lay on the bed. It was like having a conversation with someone who communicated only through silence and shadows. I hung the painting carefully, using heavy-duty picture wire and making sure it was perfectly level. The process took longer than it should have because I kept stopping to stare at the skull, losing track of what I was doing. There was something hypnotic about those hollow eyes, something that made it difficult to look away once you started. I found myself wondering who had painted it and why they had chosen such a dark subject matter. That first night, I lay awake for hours just staring at the painting. The skull's bone structure was elegant in its own way, with those high cheekbones and strong jaw that suggested both intelligence and determination. The teeth were unusually straight and white, visible through the slightly parted lips in what might have been a smile or might have been something else entirely. The hair flowed around the face like dark water, framing the skull in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. Something about the overall shape of the face nagged at me, like I was trying to remember something important that remained just beyond my grasp. The proportions were familiar somehow, though I couldn't place where I might have seen them before. It was the feeling you get when you recognize someone from a distance, but can't quite remember their name or how you know them. I finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning and had the strangest dreams. I was standing in front of a mirror in a room I didn't recognize, but instead of my normal reflection, I saw the skull from the painting looking back at me. Its mouth moved like it was trying to speak, but no words came out. Just that patient, knowing expression that suggested it had all the time in the world to wait for me to understand whatever message it was trying to convey. The dream felt more real than most of my waking moments. I could feel the cool air on my skin, smell the musty odor of the unknown room, hear the subtle creaking of old floorboards beneath my feet. When the skull in the mirror tried to speak, I felt compelled to lean closer, as if getting nearer would help me understand what it was trying to tell me. But every time I moved toward the mirror, the skull would fade slightly, becoming more translucent until I could barely see it at all. When I woke up the next morning, I felt groggy and disoriented, like I hadn't really slept at all, but had been working hard at something I couldn't quite remember. My neck was stiff and my eyes felt dry, as if I had been staring at something bright for too long. I made coffee and toast, then stood in front of the painting while my breakfast cooled on the kitchen counter. In the morning light, the skull looked slightly different than I remembered. The jaw seemed to be positioned differently, more closed than it had been the night before. The teeth were less visible, hidden behind lips that appeared more tightly pressed together. But that was impossible, of course. Paintings don't change overnight. It had to be the different lighting, or maybe I was remembering incorrectly. At work that Monday, I found myself thinking about the painting constantly. During meetings, I would zone out and picture those hollow eye sockets staring back at me from across my bedroom. I started sketching skulls on notepads during phone calls without realizing what I was doing until a coworker pointed it out. The drawings were surprisingly detailed for unconscious doodles, showing the same bone structure and proportions as the painting. My supervisor, Mike, noticed my distraction and joked that I was going through a goth phase, but I just laughed it off and tried to focus on my tasks. How could I explain that I had spent $800 on a painting of a skull, or that I couldn't stop thinking about it? That would make me sound crazy, or at least deeply troubled. So I kept my obsession to myself and counted the minutes until I could go home and see the painting again. The commute home seemed to take forever. Traffic was heavier than usual, and I found myself growing impatient with every red light and slow-moving vehicle. I was eager to see the painting again, to study those features that seemed so familiar yet impossible to place. It was like being homesick for something I had only owned for 3 days. As soon as I walked into my bedroom that evening, I knew something had changed. The skull's jawbone was definitely positioned differently, more closed than it had been when I left that morning. The teeth were barely visible now, hidden behind lips that seemed more tightly pressed together. The overall expression had shifted from neutral to something that might have been concentration or deep thought. I stared at the painting for over an hour, comparing it to my memory of how it had looked before. The differences were subtle but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. The bone structure itself seemed slightly different too, though I couldn't identify exactly what had shifted. It was like looking at the same person after they had lost weight or changed their hairstyle, recognizably the same, but somehow transformed in fundamental ways. That night, I took a photo of the painting with my phone before going to bed. If it was changing, I wanted to document the process. The camera flash reflected off the surface of the canvas in strange ways, creating highlights and shadows that weren't visible to the naked eye. In the photo, the skull's eyes seemed to glimmer with an inner light that made them look almost alive. The next morning, I compared the photo to what I saw on the wall. The differences were small, but undeniable. The eye sockets had shifted slightly, becoming more almond-shaped and less round. The cheekbones appeared higher and more pronounced. Even the hair looked different, shorter and more textured than it had been in the photo from just 8 hours earlier. By the end of the first week, I was certain the painting was changing. Each morning brought new, subtle alterations that accumulated into more significant transformations. I started taking photos every night before bed, then comparing them to what I saw each morning. The changes were always small but consistent, like someone was making tiny adjustments to the image while I slept. The skull was becoming more familiar with each passing day, not just in the sense that I was getting used to looking at it, but actually familiar. Like I was seeing the face of someone I knew, someone I had met before, but couldn't quite place. The bone structure was taking on characteristics that seemed personally significant, though I couldn't understand why. I tried researching the painting online using reverse image searches and art databases, but found nothing. No record of the artist, no documentation of previous owners, no mention of it in any gallery or auction catalog. It was like the thing had simply appeared in the world fully formed, waiting for someone like me to discover it at an estate sale. 2 weeks after buying the painting, I had a revelation that made my stomach clench with recognition. I was getting ready for work, looking at myself in the bathroom mirror while I brushed my teeth. The reflection showed my normal face, flesh and blood and tired morning eyes. But when I turned to glance at the painting through the bedroom doorway, I saw the same basic bone structure looking back at me. The skull was becoming me. Not copying me exactly, but transforming into what my face would look like if you stripped away all the soft tissue and left only the underlying architecture. The eye sockets were matching the shape of my own eyes. The cheekbones were positioning themselves exactly where mine were. Even the slight asymmetry of my jaw was being reflected in the painted bone. I called in sick to work that day, claiming I had a stomach bug. In reality, I couldn't concentrate on anything except the painting. The resemblance was becoming stronger by the hour, like an invisible artist was using my face as a reference and making constant corrections to improve the likeness. I spent the entire day sitting on my bed, staring at the skull and trying to understand what was happening. The hair was changing too. What had started as long, straight locks flowing around the skull's face was becoming shorter and more textured. The color was shifting from pure black to a dark brown that matched my own hair exactly. Even the way it fell around the skull's face was starting to mirror the way my hair looked when I got out of the shower in the morning. By the end of the second week, people at work were starting to comment on my appearance. "You look tired," my boss mentioned during a team meeting. "Are you eating enough?" asked Janet from accounting when we passed in the hallway. "Maybe you should see a doctor," suggested my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, when I picked up my mail. I looked the same to myself when I checked mirrors, but apparently something about me was changing in ways others could detect. 3 weeks after the purchase, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was comparing a photo I had taken of the painting to my own reflection in the bathroom mirror when I noticed something in the bottom right corner of the canvas. There, painted in colors so dark they almost disappeared into the background, was a signature. Not an artist's name, but my own signature in tiny letters. The same looping handwriting I used on checks and important documents. I hadn't signed the painting. I had never touched it with a brush or pen. But there was my name, written in my own distinctive style, claiming ownership of this image of what I would look like after death. The skull seemed to smile at me from its canvas, and for the first time I was certain I saw its jaw move just slightly, as if it was pleased that I had finally noticed this detail. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the skull watching me from across the room. When I opened them, it was looking in a slightly different direction, as if it had been turning its head to follow my movements around the bed. The resemblance to my own face was now so strong that it was like looking at myself in a funhouse mirror that showed only bone and shadow. I started having headaches during the day, sharp pains that came and went without warning. They were always worst when I was looking at the painting, like something was trying to push its way out of my skull from the inside. Sometimes the pain was so intense I had to close my eyes and wait for it to pass, but I always opened them again, always returned my gaze to those familiar hollow sockets. 4 weeks in, the transformation was undeniable. The skull now wore my exact facial structure, down to the small scar on my left cheekbone from a childhood accident involving a playground swing. The eye sockets were positioned at precisely the same angle as my own eyes. The teeth were arranged in the same, slightly imperfect pattern as my own dental work, including a small chip on the left incisor that I had gotten from biting down on an olive pit. If someone had taken my head and stripped away everything but bone, this is exactly what they would find underneath. The painting wasn't just resembling me, it was becoming me in the most fundamental way possible. It was showing me what I really looked like beneath all the temporary flesh and blood and skin. I stopped going out except for work and essential errands. Something about sunlight bothered me now, made my skin feel tight and uncomfortable. I preferred the dim lighting of my bedroom, where I could sit with the painting for hours without strain. Fluorescent lights gave me headaches, and I found myself squinting constantly when I had to be in brightly lit spaces. My world was shrinking down to just me and my reflection on the wall. I canceled social plans, stopped returning phone calls, avoided my neighbors in the hallway. The painting required all my attention now, and I didn't want to waste energy on meaningless interactions with people who couldn't understand what I was experiencing. The skull's expression was changing too. What had started as a neutral death mask was now showing distinct emotion. The slight tilt of the head, the angle of the jaw, the way the eye sockets seemed to focus on specific points in the room. It all suggested someone who was thinking, feeling, experiencing something profound. The skull was becoming alive in ways that should have been impossible for a painting. 5 weeks after buying the painting, something new appeared in the image. Behind the skull, barely visible in the dark background, was the suggestion of a body. Just the faintest outline of shoulders and a chest, painted in shades of gray so subtle I might have imagined them if I hadn't been studying the painting so intently. But each day, the body became slightly more visible, taking on form and substance. My health was starting to decline in noticeable ways. I had lost 15 pounds without trying, and my face looked gaunt in mirrors. Dark circles ringed my eyes, and my skin had taken on a grayish tint that made me look constantly ill. People at work started asking if I was feeling okay, if I needed to take time off to recover from whatever was wrong with me. But I felt fine, even energetic, like something was giving me strength even as my body weakened. I needed less sleep than before, could go for hours without eating, felt more alert and focused than I had in years. It was as if the painting was feeding me somehow, providing energy that my physical body no longer required. The painting had become my complete obsession. I thought about it constantly at work, dreamed about it at night, rushed home each day to check for new changes. It was never quite the same as I had left it. Some detail would always be different. A shadow shifted, a line refined, a new element added to make the resemblance even more perfect. I started keeping a journal of the changes, documenting each transformation with photos and detailed written descriptions. The skull's evolution was following a pattern, though I couldn't predict what would happen next. Each change seemed to bring it closer to some final form, some ultimate expression of whatever it was trying to become. 6 weeks in, the body in the painting was clearly visible. It wore clothes that looked exactly like the ones in my closet. The same blue button-down shirt I had worn to work the day before. The same dark jeans I put on every weekend. The skull sat atop a frame that could have been traced from my own body, matching my height and build perfectly. It was like looking at myself after death, seeing what I would become when everything soft and temporary rotted away. The image should have been horrifying, but instead it filled me with a strange sense of completion. Like I was finally seeing my true self, the essential me that had been hidden beneath flesh and blood and social expectations. People were actively avoiding me now. I could see the fear in their eyes when they looked at me, though I couldn't understand what they were seeing. In mirrors, I looked the same as always. Maybe a little thinner, a little more tired, but still recognizably human. Yet somehow, others sensed something fundamentally wrong with me that I couldn't detect myself. My supervisor called me into his office and suggested I take some time off. "You've been distracted lately," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Maybe you need a break to deal with whatever's going on in your personal life." I agreed to take a week of vacation, though I had no intention of actually going anywhere. I just wanted more time to spend with the painting. 7 weeks after the auction, I noticed that the painting was starting to show not just my skeleton, but my death. The clothes on the body were torn and stained with dark substances I didn't want to identify. The bones themselves were cracked and yellowed, showing the wear of age and decay. Shadows suggested corruption and rot, things growing in places where flesh used to be. But instead of horrifying me, the image filled me with a strange peace. Like I was seeing my true self for the first time, stripped of all pretense and social expectations. The skull was honest in a way my living face could never be. It showed what I really was underneath all the temporary flesh and blood and the lies I told myself about being alive. I stopped eating regular food during the 7th week. Everything tasted like ash and cardboard, and my throat seemed to reject solid substances. I survived on water and the occasional sip of milk, but I wasn't hungry. The painting was sustaining me somehow, feeding me with energy that didn't come from normal sources. 8 weeks in, I made a discovery that changed my understanding of everything. Late at night, when the room was dark except for a small bedside lamp, I caught my reflection in the bedroom window. For just a moment, instead of my normal face, I saw the skull from the painting looking back at me. Same eye sockets, same jaw, same patient expression of eternal waiting. I blinked and my regular face returned, but I knew what I had seen. The painting wasn't just showing me what I would become after death. It was showing me what I was becoming right now, while still technically alive. The transformation was happening to me, not just to the image on my wall. The realization should have terrified me, but instead it felt like a relief. Like I was finally understanding a truth that had been hidden from me my entire life. The flesh was just a disguise, a temporary costume I had been wearing without knowing it. The skull was the real me, the essential truth that had always been there beneath the surface. I started spending entire days sitting on my bed, staring at the skull and feeling the changes happening inside my own body. My bones were shifting, aligning themselves with the painted image. My flesh was thinning, becoming more translucent. Sometimes, when the light hit me just right, I could see the outline of my skull beneath my skin. 9 weeks after buying the painting, I stopped going to work altogether. I called in sick one Monday and simply never went back. My boss left several voicemails asking if I was okay, but I couldn't explain what was happening to me. How could I tell him that I was slowly becoming a painting of my own death? That I was transforming into something that existed between life and death? The painting was almost complete now. Every detail perfect, every line exactly right. The skull sat in my clothes, in my posture, wearing my expression. It was me in every way that mattered, stripped down to the essential truth beneath all the temporary flesh. And when I looked in windows or mirrors now, that's what I saw looking back more often than my human face. I could feel others calling to me now. Previous owners of the painting, people who had gone through the same transformation I was experiencing. They were waiting somewhere beyond flesh, beyond the need for breath or blood or beating hearts. They were patient and peaceful and complete in ways they had never been while pretending to be alive. 10 weeks in, I understood what the painting really was. Not just an image, but a doorway. A way of showing people what they really were beneath all the lies they told themselves about being alive. The skull wasn't dying. It was more alive than I had ever been. It was eternal, unchanging, honest in ways that flesh could never be. My reflection in mirrors was now the skull, more often than my flesh face. People on the street, the few times I ventured out, would stop and stare at me with expressions of confusion and fear. They could sense what I was becoming, even if they couldn't understand it. Their primitive minds recognized death even when it wore the mask of life. I no longer needed food or water. My body was running on something else now, some energy that came from the painting itself, or from the place beyond it where the others waited. I was becoming part of something larger, something more honest than individual existence. 11 weeks after the purchase, the transformation was nearly complete. My skin had become so thin it was almost transparent. My bones showed through clearly now, white and clean beneath the fading flesh. I no longer cast a normal shadow. Instead, the outline of a skull followed me wherever I went. The painting had taught me that death wasn't the opposite of life, but its most honest expression. All the years I had spent pretending to be alive, worrying about careers and relationships and meaningless social obligations had been wasted time. The skull was what I had always been, what everyone was beneath their temporary costumes of flesh. I stopped paying bills, stopped answering the phone, stopped pretending to be part of the world of the living. My landlord would eventually come looking for rent, but by then I would be gone. Not dead exactly, but transformed into something that existed between life and death, between the painting and the place beyond it where truth lived. 12 weeks in, I could barely see my flesh face at all. Every mirror, every window, every reflective surface showed me the skull I had become. My teeth were visible through skin so thin it might as well have been tissue paper. My eye sockets were deep caves in a face that was more bone than anything else. But I had never felt more alive. The painting had shown me truth, and truth was more energizing than any food or drink. I was becoming part of something eternal, something that had always existed and would never die. The skull wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The skull in the painting was no longer just my death. It was my birth, the birth of my true self. the self that had been hiding beneath skin and muscle and all the other lies I had told myself about being human. Soon I would join the others who had learned the same truth, who had discovered what they really were beneath all that soft, temporary flesh. 13 weeks after buying the painting, I am ready. The transformation is complete, or nearly so. I am the skull now, and the skull is me. We are the same thing, a perfect representation of death that is somehow more alive than life ever was. I am ready to become part of something larger, something honest and eternal. I understand now why the painting had been through so many estate sales and auctions, why it always found its way to people who needed to see it. It wasn't really for sale. It was just moving from one student to the next, teaching the same lesson over and over again. The lesson that flesh was temporary, but bone was forever. The painting will find its next owner soon. Someone who needs to learn what I have learned, who needs to see their true self reflected in bone and shadow. I will be there to guide them, to help them understand that death is not the end, but the beginning of truth. And when they complete their own transformation, when they discover what they really are beneath all that temporary flesh, I will welcome them home. We all will. Because we are all the same thing in the end, skulls wearing masks of life, pretending to be something we never really were. The painting looks more like me every day because every day I become more like what I really am. Soon there will be no difference at all between us. Soon I will be free of the lie I've been living, the pretense that I was ever anything other than bone and shadow and eternal truth. I bought an expensive display picture, and it was worth every penny. It showed me myself in a way no mirror ever could. It taught me that death is not the end of life. It is the beginning of honesty. And now I wait, patient as bone, for the next person who needs to learn the same lesson. The skull smiles at me from its canvas, and I smile back with teeth that are finally, completely, truthfully my own.